Hi, and welcome to today's webcast brought to you by Fire Engineering. Today's event, Fighting Cancer on the Fireground, one department's model will be presented by Trevor Nelson, Fire District 9's Chief of Hazardous Materials of the Jacksonville Fire Department down there in Florida. It's also being sponsored by our great friends at Tempest. Hey, after this webcast, go to Tempest.com and look at all the fantastic products that Tempest has to offer. They're an amazing company. Tempest is a huge supporter of fire engineering and FDIC. Owned by some of the finest people I've ever had the opportunity to work with. They've sponsored tons of research and tons of studies on firefighting tactics, and they make just outstanding equipment. So please go to Tempest.com at the end of this webcast and give our friends at Tempest a good look and make sure you consider them in your next purchasing considerations. Before we begin, I want to cover a few housekeeping items. I'm getting a sound over here. Are we okay?
I'm here.
Yes, go right ahead.
Trevor, good. Okay, did we get your introduction or was I being overrun by a video? Quick question.
Let's begin at housekeeping.
Okay, guys. All right, so a couple of housekeeping tips. Before we begin, a couple of housekeeping items. At the bottom of your console, there's some application widgets you can use at any time during the webcast. If you want to ask a question, there's a Q&A widget. Just click on that, ask your question, and we'll answer all the questions at the end of the webcast. That's the best way to do business. And any questions that Trevor can't get to, we'll post them up on fireengineering.com within a day or two as soon as he can get to them. If you have additional resources been provided for this webcast, such as a PDF of the slide deck, you can download it on the resource list at the bottom folder, that little green folder at the bottom of your screen. You can expand the slide area anytime you want with the maximize icon at the top of the right-hand side and drag in the corner just to enlarge it, just like you would with any other computer program. In fact, you can expand and reposition a bunch of the components on the screen, so feel free to rearrange it any way you want just to make yourself more comfortable. If you have any technical difficulty during the webcast, please click on the Help widget. It has a question mark icon, and it can address common technical issues. If you still need assistance, just type your question into the Q&A widget, and a member of our crack support team will be there to work with you. For your convenience, this presentation will be available on demand within 24 hours of the event. A reminder email will be sent to all the registrants with a link to the archive within 24 hours on our homepage at Fire Engineering. Now, let me tell you a little bit about our good friend Trevor. He's a second-generation firefighter with the Jacksonville Fire Rescue Department. He began firefighting in 1991. He arrived at Jacksonville with his paramedic certification. Then he obtained his AS degree in EMS management. He also competed through their highly competitive promotional process to all the way to the rank of engineer, serving both in rescue and suppression divisions. In '96, Trevor was appointed as a suppression lieutenant. In 2003, he was promoted to the rank of captain. From 2008, he furthered his education, the associate degrees. He became the first ever graduate of a 4-year degree with Bachelor of Applied Science in Fire Science Management. And in 2011, Trevor was promoted to district chief, serving in the Lakewood stations and also heading up the Hazardous Materials Unit while on shift. Also during 2011, Trevor obtained his master's degree in public administration from Barry University. In 2015, Trevor was taken on the role of incident safety chief while serving at Marietta Station and currently teaches tactics as an adjunct role with the Florida Gateway College down there as an EMS instructor. He recently published in Fire Engineering in 2014, Reducing the Incidence of Cancer, in our December edition. An excellent read. Please take some time to pull that up. He's led the local chapter of the Fellowship of Christian Firefighters since 2000, very active in his local church where he serves as a men's ministry leader, and he spends countless hours volunteering not only in his community as a swim coach but at the local YMCA, and spends some weeks in Honduras each year on mission stuff. He's got a gorgeous wife, Amy, of 17 years, 2 daughters, Kaylee and Kara. And Trevor, if you are all set, why don't you take it away? I can't wait to see your presentation. As you well know, cancer is such a big issue in the fire service. I'm actually down here in Champaign, Illinois, where we're doing a 12-day study on cancer with UL NIST and the good folks from Skidmore College and University of Illinois Fire Services Institute. So what you're speaking about today is critically important to the fire service. Can't wait to hear your presentation, and I'll be back with the questions at the end. So it's all yours, boss.
Thank you, Bobby. I appreciate that wonderful introduction. This project came about as part of my master's capstone project in 2014. I actually pushed it to your magazine, and you guys decided to publish it. It was based on that article that this webcast is about, which the article was Reducing the Incidence of Cancer Among Firefighters, Jacksonville's Best Practices. And that was in the, as he said, the December 2014 edition. One of the things that when we started this program, I have to give a shout out to my friend who is not able to be with us today, but is Chief Kurt Wilson. He is actually the backbone of this program. This was kind of his idea, and I actually took his ideas and put them down on paper. Took a lot of the research that he had put together, and if we go back to the first slide, you'll see it's called Surviving Your Career, and that was kind of the program that was started in the Jacksonville Fire Department, called Surviving Your Career, so that way we could start thinking about these calls as what is happening. Why are firefighters facing more incidents of cancer? So we're going to go through each slide here, and I'll talk about it. Bobby gave me a great intro on my biography. You can look at this later if you like. And then obviously Chief Wilson, he has a great bio also. So let's get started on why we're here today. The JFRD model, why we started this program and why we've made a change and a difference. We know that there's firefighter cancer is on the rise, and the risks are growing exponentially. We've started this innovative program to try and improve firefighters' health and safety by reducing our exposure to toxins on the fireground. One of the things that as Chief Wilson has expressed on our job is that the exposure to carcinogens and things, as we see bunker gear covered in soot in ads in magazines, it's kind of troubling when you see that. So actually, I was proud to see in the IAFF newsletter this month, all the manufacturers, all their bunker gear was clean. There wasn't dirty bunker gear. And I think that's where we're headed as a nationwide progression with keeping our stuff clean and keeping our exposures down to a minimum. So today we're going to look at what we're doing in JFRD, which is the Jacksonville Fire Rescue Department. And so we can talk about lowering our cancer risk when we fight fires. So we're going to learn first what motivated us, what we're doing today, and then what others can do and may be done in the future to reduce our exposure to carcinogens. So obviously whenever you do a master's capstone project, there's always a research question to be asked. And my research question was, what changes in our department were we implementing in the organizational culture to combat the problem of cancer in the fire service? And so anytime you do a study, you look at methodology. We looked at a meta-analysis of various qualitative and quantitative studies that have been previously performed by other institutions of higher learning, such as the NIOSH or OSHA. And also the idea is relative to a changing climate within the JFRD. And obviously it is my employer. I've been employed here for 24 years. And also Chief Wilson's, he was the heart and soul of this project. And he was the initiator of the culture change within our department at the time that we began this project, and that my paper was written. So best practice assessment is what we did. We started looking at some departments around the country. I was actually in hazmat technician class when I was writing the paper, and there were several instructors that came in from around the country, well-known instructors through the IAFF. And that we did a survey method with several of those and personal interviews. And also part of our methodology was to look at our standard operating procedures concerning overhaul and how we were approaching overhaul in our department, and gauging our various approaches to overhaul throughout the country, not only here in Jacksonville, but in other cities and counties within various size departments. So we looked at smaller departments. We actually looked at some very small volunteer departments and we also looked at some large departments around the country. So some of the findings that we found, and a lot of this stuff is we're just covering again that's been seen around the country, is that we know that smoke is contaminated with particulates that contain carcinogens and other toxins. Firefighters have higher rates of cancer, including mesothelioma, which is twice as high. These firefighters are exposed excessively to contaminants at an alarming rate. Our PPE can only prevent if it's properly used, which for example, it's clean and free of contaminants. And firefighters can reduce their exposure rate by reducing their time, distance, and provide better shielding. Any firefighter that's got any kind of hazmat training recognizes these terms from radiation exposure. And we just started thinking about it as in the same realm with hazardous materials and exposure to carcinogens. So what was the conclusion of my research question? JFRD is accomplishing this by a better plan for overhaul. We started trying to think about the fire scene as offense versus defensive mode of fire. And we're going to break down each one of these as we go along. Better rehabbing our firefighters, better decontaminating our PPE, treating all products of combustions as hazardous materials, providing for better documentation for firefighter incidents and mortality of cancer, and providing more information to personnel on the dangers in which they are exposed and consequences of such. So, breaking down the problem with cancer in the fire service. First of all, firefighters have 2 times the rate of mesothelioma than the general population. And a lot of this is because we are exposed directly to asbestos from when we do overhaul. We break down walls that have been sealed up for years and the insulation hasn't been changed out. And so we get exposed when we're in there overhauling a structure and we're not wearing the proper SCBA or PPE. And also increased incidence and morbidity of other cancers such as multiple myeloma, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, testicular, and bladder cancer. So the management decisions, that's some of the ones that managers have to make, some of the best practices. Ethical decisions are based on well-documented science and understanding organizational cultural changes that are needed to affect positive within the organization. So how did it start in JFRD? The timeline in our department was Lieutenant Eugene Johnson, back in the 70s, died in a supermarket fire from anoxia after being trapped while using a canister mask without oxygen. The next day, the chief of the department ordered the change to self-contraining breathing apparatus, or SCBAs, as we all know. This positive cultural change occurred when faced with negative situation while making an ethical decision. Badge of honor. Firefighters never want to be assumed to be lazy. That was part of that culture with not wearing your SCBA. A lot of times that you weren't tough if you wore an SCBA back in the 70s. So whenever it switched from wearing canister mask to SCBA, it was a tough cultural change. But a lot of firefighters saw that as a badge of honor. Same as when I was in EMS when I first came on. Some of the old rescue guys would wear their uniform and they would have blood on their shirt. It used to be a badge of honor. Nobody wants to be assumed lazy. Same as no one would want to take their car to a mechanic that didn't have grease on their fingernails and not a greasy uniform. It's the same with our bunker gear or PPE. No one wants to have a dirty or a clean, brand new looking helmet and clean gear. That was the old mindset that we're trying to change it with a cultural change here in Jacksonville, and I think the scene around the culture is that badge of honor of having that dirty gear is not a badge of honor. That is something that we're trying to change, the mindset of that. So the problem is, first of all, is thinking about bunker gear, and you'll see a lot of things in my slides. It's changing the name from bunker gear and PPE. Bunker gear, as its name applies, it came from the idea that our pants were rolled down at night, sitting next to your bunk, which this eventually brings contaminants and soot into the living environment. Why is this important? It's because a lot of times what a lot of the studies are showing. Toronto firefighters. If you look back at the study that they did, they saw excessive amounts of brain and nervous system cancers. Many firefighters died within 5 years of retirement, and the average age of death was 63 years old. Phoenix Fire Department hazmat. Our Chief Wilson had contacted some folks in Phoenix, and they had actually said that there was a lot of chemicals that were in the air that appeared, when the air appeared clear to the naked eye. They actually wore these, they called them like Christmas tree vests, and the guys, when they were wearing them, they were highlighting different chemicals. They were showing that there were allergens, asphyxiants, and carcinogens located in the air that they were in that actually looked clear. And it actually changed the way that Phoenix performed overhaul. Going back to my last slide when we were talking about the bunker gear beside the bed, we were talking about changing the mindset of changing the idea of calling it bunker gear to just changing it to PPE, because no longer do we want to think about keeping dirty gear by our bed. One of our captains that has passed on from cancer was quoted years ago saying that he liked his bunker gear beside his bed at night because if they had just came from a fire, he liked the smell of the wood burning off of the fire that was on his gear. But unfortunately, a few years later, he died of cancer. So just some more studies that we wanted to look at when we did this project was we looked at the University of Cincinnati College of Medicine study. They did a meta-analysis on 32 firefighter cancer studies. So they looked at a bunch of different studies. Firefighters were found to have a higher likelihood of risk from 3 types of cancer: multiple myeloma, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, prostate cancer, and then they also found that testicular cancer was probable with 2 times the higher rate for firefighters. The NIOSH study showed excess cancer morbidity and mortality in firefighters, and also showed firefighters were 2 times more likely to develop mesothelioma. And then a particulate study was showing that when they did a study of actual particulates in the soot and the smoke, that there was particles in the smoke that would actually combine with carcinogens, and these carcinogens were able to reach the deepest portions of the lungs. As Chief Wilson kind of presented to us, when you have black boogies coming out of your nose, that is carcinogens that can be attached to smoke. And if you've ever been in a fire and you've pushed out, or you've blew your nose, or you sneezed and you've had black stuff coming out of your nose, there's a possibility that you've brought carcinogens down into your lungs. Particulates also include asbestos, which we all know that is the form of lung cancer caused from asbestos that mesothelioma is. There was 2 cluster studies also that we looked at with Seattle firefighters, and they had 1 in 3 cancer rate at the development at the time when the study was performed. And also there was some stories about the Wade chemical dump fire, and that there were nearly 200 rescuers exposed to a burning slurry of hazardous waste chemicals. And nearly 20 years later, 28 rescuers have died of various cancers and neurological issues. So, as with anything, we looked at our own firefighters in the Jacksonville Fire Department. One of the quotes was from one of our retired lieutenants: "If you read the obituaries like I do, police officers live longer than firemen do." And another retired firefighter say, "I go to every retired fireman's funeral. They don't die of old age. We all die of cancer." At the time we started doing the study, we were looking at normal life expectancy, and average was 5 years after retirement. Simultaneous cancer diagnosis with employees that worked in close relation to each other. We had a couple situations where firefighters were being treated in cancer treatment centers, and they look across the aisle and there's another firefighter, and they get talking to each other, and they were actually on the same call, and they actually had the same or similar cancer that was not a common cancer at the time. These were some of the lives of our firefighters that were recognized throughout our department, and you can see some of the different chemical fires that they were part of. throughout the history of the fire department, all these folks have already passed on. Lives were cut short due to cancer. And at number 12 there, Andre Hill's young man, I'm not sure of his age, probably wasn't even 30 years old, and he recently died of cancer while actively serving on our job. So what is the cultural change we're trying to institute in the JFRD and actually pass through the country? First of all is to see every fire as a hazardous materials incident. Treat those contaminants that are on our helmets, or on our gloves, on our bunker coat, or our PPE, our hoods. Treat it as the soots and particulates as hazardous materials. Decreasing the amount of exposures to toxins. Dr. James Lockey said there's a critical and immediate need for additional protective equipment to help firefighters to avoid inhalation and skin exposures to known and suspected carcinogens. Do we really need more protective equipment, or do we better utilize equipment we currently have? And I think the answer to that is yes on both. We always need to be refining and getting our equipment better, but we also need to better utilize the equipment we currently have. And that's part of the cultural change. I like this cartoon by Combs, and talking about cancer going in one ear and out the other. Now tell me again why I should be wearing my SCBA during overhaul. So here's what we started to do in Jacksonville was accomplishing the task. Wearing our SCBA and PPE at all times, even during overhaul phase, which we've decided to call it the defensive side of the fire. We try to think of it as the offensive time is when everybody's in the middle of the fight and we're trying to get the fire under control. And then the defensive time of the fire is when we got the fire under control, but we know we're going to have to still go back in and overhaul. It's a time when we can take a breath. And sometimes our fires, like most, we're able to knock them out in 10 or 15 minutes. And that first in ladder and engine crew will be able to go in and do the overhaul. But there are instances when that first two crews or three crews in, it takes a full SCBA bottle, and we don't want anyone to be tempted with the chance of wanting to go back in without an SCBA bottle because they're tired, or not wear their full PPE because they're tired. So our idea is if they use a full SCBA bottle, and then our idea is to bring in a fresh crew as a defensive team for overhaul. Now, I know I'm speaking throughout the country, and Jacksonville is a large department, and we have 53 fire engines and 12 ladder trucks, and I know that's a big deal. That we can call in a defensive team, and I know that around the country a lot of you guys don't have that option to call in crews just for overhaul. But I think I got thinking about it. I thought about mutual aid agreements, and if we all know that we're going to help each other and we already have agreements for structure fires, then I think if we go in with the understanding that we're helping our brother and sister firefighters by going in and doing their overhaul for them, then when we reciprocate back whenever they have a fire, or excuse me, when we have a fire, they come and help us. So I think it just takes some talking over with your crews. But the main idea that I wanted to impress was that we get a second crew that has not been inside the fire, that's not going to want to be tempted to not wear their gear fully, not wear their SCBA, and actually go in as a defense and looking more at it from for protective purposes. The next point is gross decontamination of PPE at the scene. We obviously, if we're going to treat it as a hazardous materials incident, we want to look at possibly trying to grossly decon the PPE at the scene, just as you would a hazmat incident. We all have practice with that if we're a hazmat tech or specialist. So we want to make sure that we do at least some form of gross decon, because I know that there's not the option for a lot of folks around the country of having a second set of gear available at that time. it is very expensive, as we know. So at least getting some of the contaminants off. Another thing that we've seen throughout the country is I saw a couple of weeks ago of wash your hood Sunday, taking everybody's hood and washing them on Sunday to make sure that there's no contaminants. And what we'd like to try to see is at least if you don't have a second set of gear, at least have a second hood to where if that first hood gets dirty, that's the one of the things that's closest to your body, especially the areas that they're finding a lot of cancers around the thyroid and everything around the face. So always wearing a clean hood is, I think, a good policy to at least start with, and cleaning gear obviously is a next great best practice. But also rehabbing crews at the scene is important. The Cancer Survivor Network has got a checklist, and one of the things that they talk about is making sure that you clean your body and your gear. Wipes at the scene, deconning your gear at the scene best you can. If you have a station washer and you're able to wash it and you have a second set, obtaining cleaning replacement gear for usage until the other gear is laundered. That's a proposal, but in a department with 1,200 members as we have, that's a very expensive proposal, something that we would like to see happen in the future. And then also increasing medical examinations for all personnel. I think that's an important part of detecting cancer early. In Jacksonville, we have a company that does medical examinations that looks through, but currently they only do a portion of the department, and we'd like to see an increase for all personnel. Contamination reduction. One of the things that we've talked about too is in our current practices to utilize high volume gas powered PPV or positive terrestrial ventilation to remove the majority of contaminants from the structure. And then once all visible smoke clears the structure, the gasoline PPV is replaced with smaller electrical PPV to finish clearing the structure of carbon monoxide, which is a byproduct of the gasoline-powered fans. So this will ensure that we return those CO levels, those carbon monoxide levels, down to the NIOSH recommended levels. And kind of the philosophy is when we do that, when we use these PPV fans, we're reducing the CO level. The thought is that maybe the contaminant levels are further reduced before turning the structure over to the homeowner and residents, all the while firefighters are wearing an SCBA during the overhaul phase of operations. So that's the goal of using those electric fans once we've used the gas-powered fans. Once we've got the structure cleared of all visible smoke, then we just try to reduce and eliminate as much smoke as we can visible, and then use the electric fans while we're doing overhaul and clearing the structure further. In Jacksonville, we use what's called the W signals. A W3 is all hands have been dispatched to the call on the assignment. And what we had to come up with a way to differentiate between the offensive mode and the defensive mode, and we call that the W4 signal. That means that the fire signal is to indicate a transition, that we're bringing in a defensive. We're going to go from offensive to defensive, and not talking about fire tactics when we're actually attacking the fire from an offensive mode to a defensive mode. We're just talking about from offensive as far as when we're actually actively fighting fire, to a defensive where we're going to protect ourselves from exposure using our SCBAs during the overhaul portion of the firefight. So offense is actively fighting fire, whether it be in the traditional sense of offensive or defensive fire attack. And in defense mode for this W4 signal policy is when you actually are backing off for the overhaul mode. One of the things that we are doing with our W4 policy is we send a rescue chief as a health and safety officer on the scene to make sure our folks are entering the rehab and getting checked out. It just adds another layer of command to our system. We have a rehab unit set up for these large incidents and extra rescue units that are dispatched. And then also that part of that defensive mode is that extra engine and ladder for overhaul purposes. We can dispatch those from non-affected territories across town on a non-emergent status. And we notify those crews by telephone that they're being sent to a structure fire, but they're going as an overhaul. They need to respond, lights and siren. It's a non-emergent situation. They're coming in to do overhaul, and they just need to be prepared when they get there to do that. And this again, it comes in play whenever we have units that are that need to have mutual aid agreements. The smaller departments around the country, this may be something you might want to work on getting together again with those departments. Changing the culture. One of the things that kind of was impressed upon me was to stop calling our PPE bunker gear. In other words, your gear needs to stay out of the bunker area, the bunk area, the living quarters. So this is going to take a cultural change in our mindset, calling it personal protective equipment. Getting a handle on cancer victims in the JFRD, Jacksonville Fire Rescue Department. Doing a cancer study among active and retired firefighters. We've actually started that in our department. We actually sent out a survey to our active and retired firefighters since this paper was written, and we're getting some of the information now. Miami-Dade has done a great study. One of the things that we're trying to do in Florida is to get cancer presumption passed in Florida. Well, Florida is one of the states that does not have cancer presumption. But the biggest goal of the whole idea of changing our culture is to get the JFRD out of the cancer game. And the last slide that I have is national recognition. The W4 policy that I mentioned a couple slides back, where we actually go to from an offensive to a defensive mode in overhaul. It was presented in Los Angeles at the Firefighter Cancer Survival Network, and it's actually been adopted as a national best practice. So we've actually got some national recognition with this new policy. So at this point, that's all I have as far as I think at this time we're going to answer some Q&A.
Yeah, we've got a few questions that came in, and that was a very interesting deal. I mean, this is a huge issue for the American Fire Service, so if you do have some folks out there, we do have some time left. You can send in additional questions if you have them. But one of the first questions that came in from Robin Colbert, and Robin asks, do you have someone assigned to deploy your rehab unit? So is this I guess where Robin's going, not to put words in his mouth, but is this a standing unit that you have up all the time, or do you detail another company to handle your rehab?
Actually, our rehab unit is a medical support unit, which is a bus that we have. That is actually, we use it also as a rehab unit. It's air conditioned, and it has beds that we can utilize inside. And it does have an engineer assigned to that rehab unit. So every day we have a person designated that's trained to operate that unit and respond on any of the calls, whether it be the W4 or even on a special call for that unit.
Outstanding. That's nice. I think companies that have fewer resources than Jacksonville would probably have to detail a company in order to pull that off. But I think any way you do it, it's important to get it done. Here's an interesting.
And let me follow up also on that question too. One thing also is that we do an informal rehab with our rescue units. Our rescues, I say rescue. At Jacksonville, we use the term rescue as our ambulance. So we actually use those as an informal rehab until we set up a more formal rehab with that unit. Sometimes, like I talked about, if it's that 10-minute fire, the structure fire is knocked out quickly, and it is a 90-degree day, we may have to start rehabbing units informally on the scene with a rescue unit. But if it does get to be a larger fire or extreme heat, or we will bring in the larger rehab unit that is manned.
Outstanding. Good stuff. One of the questioners want to know if you're willing to share your SOPs, and that came to us from Thad Terreno. He wants to know if you'll be willing to share your SOPs.
I think that won't be a problem. I will just have to forward that to you, Bobby, and we'll have to see about getting that put up on the web later. I don't have the overhaul SOP in front of me, but yes,
okay.
I don't believe that'd be a problem.
We'll put it up on the site. Well, great. That's very kind of you, and we'll be happy to do it for you. So, Thad, there you go. As soon as we get that from Trevor, we'll put it up with the archive to this site. So here's a question that came in from Dawn Pence, and she wants to know has anyone done a exposure and cancer study on volunteer firefighters? And I can help you with that one, Trevor, if you've got any information for them, and I can also help you with some information there.
Well, our department is entirely paid personnel this time. We do have some auxiliary personnel, but we passed it through our retirees and our career personnel at this time. So I'm not sure that we have any that are volunteer that may have gotten part of the study that were volunteers in the past in our department.
I have not heard of any studies specifically on volunteer firefighters. I know there are volunteer firefighters involved in our current study that we're doing down here with the University of Illinois and UL and NIST and NIOSH. There's several volunteers involved. Obviously, just like everything else, the fire makes no distinction whether you're a career volunteer or the risks and the dangers are consistent throughout. So I know volunteers are involved in the studies down here that Skidmore and the University of Illinois are working on. These studies are clearly addressing everyone. Don also wants us to remind everyone to consider the good volunteers anytime you're working on presumptive legislation, which obviously makes sense. The term firefighter should apply to everyone who is fighting fire, clearly, whether they're a career or volunteer and everything else. My good buddy Robert Fling out of Long Island there wants to know, also known as Wear Your Face Piece, wants to know what gases you measure for other than, and do you measure for HCN?
Yes, we do. We actually have a separate meter for the HCN, and also we do measure for VOCs and the carbon monoxide, and we don't normally take in a 5-gas meter, oxygen level, obviously. So we do check for various gases, hydrogen sulfide, things of that nature.
Outstanding. And one of the study down here, 5-gas meters were used throughout the entire Fireground. So exterior, downwind, interior, and they were also checking the particulates. The NIOSH folks were with some highly sophisticated information that was looking at all the aerosolized products and the products of combustion that were in the particulate level. So that's some fascinating data that will be coming out in the future. So stay tuned for that coming down. Let's see. Here's a question from Steve DeLuca. It says, go ahead, buddy. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I think that the main part is that we're actually talking about this now, and we're opening up to new ideas and trying to protect ourselves. And like I did read that this is no longer a badge of honor to have that dirty gear and to have that dirty helmet. And when part of my job as a safety officer is to go around and inspect people's gear, and I actually put on rubber gloves before I touch anybody's gear. And they kind of look at me funny, and I say, do you realize that if there's carcinogens on this gear, I could be absorbing it all day through my skin, so I'm going to protect myself when I'm picking up gear, and you need to think about that before you leave this coat dirty. So I think getting the mindset of thinking about this is part of it. Having clean gear, having a fresh crew come in to reduce the time and exposure to the fire and to the carcinogens and things.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that's important for folks to remember is that we're not changing anything. We're heightening people's awareness. People only know what they know. You can't hold someone accountable for what they didn't know, or ascribe motive to them for what they didn't know. The firefighters were not intentionally or recklessly trying to expose themselves to cancer to show how tough they were. I think that's ascribing a motive that's illusionary and derogatory, and obviously impugns the character and integrity of a wide swath of people. They just didn't know. Much like my dad's generation, they didn't understand the dangers of cigarettes, so the Army used to issue to all the pilots 2 packs of cigarettes a day to help keep them calm, totally unaware of the cancer issue. So as people became aware, obviously fewer and fewer people smoke, and I think we're going to see the same awareness level. And the goal of people like Trevor and myself, and I've been associated with the Firefighter Cancer Support Network now for 15 years. They're 10 or 15 years. As long as we've been a network, I've been working with my good friend Mike DeBron on this issue. It's raising folks' awareness, and it's going to be one firefighter at a time. And it's important to, not ascribe ill motives to good people just because they don't know something. That I think that's something we need to be very wary of. But great stuff, and I think changing culture, as many of these questions ask about, it's really important stuff. Here's a question from my good buddy Charlie Heflin. He says, what type of decon is being done at the actual rehab afterwards? Any special cleaning solutions or anything being incorporated?
Well, actually, that's a good question, and one of the things I forgot to mention was that we're actually making them take off their gear before they even get in the rehab. And one of the things that actually was, I was on a fire. One of our captains had went in a house fire, actually used a whole bottle, and maybe even had went on to a second bottle. And when we finally got him to the rehab area, we actually took his gear, had him strip his gear off outside the bus, and we went to go take him in the bus, and we had one of our safety guys there had his meter handy, and he actually scanned him with his meter, and he was still off-gassing underneath his bunker gear, VOCs and everything, and we actually got him a sheet and had him stripped down on the scene underneath, and covered him with a sheet. And before he was able to go into the decon or the rehab unit, I actually had him towel off and clean off as best he could, and I'm certain that they do have cleaning materials to clean that unit. But we're actually preventing a lot of the exposure by preventing folks from getting inside of that rehab unit with any gear on. We're actually leaving the gear outside.
And one of the things they're doing down here, which is interesting to dovetail into what Trevor's talking about in Jacksonville, at the study, they're doffing the gear, checking their contaminant levels, but then they're also practicing 3 types of decon to see which one's most effective, cleaning, brushing, 3 different methodologies. But what's interesting is before the NIOSH people will put our bunker gear on, much as Trevor just said he wears gloves, the NIOSH people put on Tyvek suits before they get into our bunker gear, which gives you an idea of the level of contamination. The other thing that's going on here to dovetail on some of Trevor's work is that they're also taking the gear and putting them into a specially made container that's the exact dimensions of the average cab, fire engine cab, to see how much off-gassing is going on and what the contaminant levels are. Because remember, if you put your gear on and then get into that enclosed cab, there's some level of contaminant from the previous fires. But if you get back into that cab wearing all your gear, now you've brought that gear that's still off-gassing, all the products of combustion, all those toxins, and you're in that enclosed space. So they're taking a hard look at that. So, we'll probably be looking at different methodologies, to limit, the exposure as best we can, knowing now what we know. So let's get to a few more questions. We got a bunch from here, and they're still coming in. I think folks are enjoying your answers here. Charlie Heflin wants to know real quick. It's a personal question about you, Trevor. Are you on Twitter? I'm
actually on Twitter. I've not tweeted anything before, but I'm actually on there to So, yes, you can find me, Trevor Nelson. I'm not sure of even what my hashtag is.
Okay. Another question we have is, will the Q&A be available later on the webcast? Yes, it will. That was an easy one. Here we go. This is from Joe Shoemaker, and Joe says, he survived cancer twice. My department continues to take positive steps to educate our members on cancer prevention. Have you found any alternatives to wearing SCBAs during overhaul that provide as good a protection?
Well, Joe, we actually talked about, this is a great question, by the way, and I actually wanted to cover it, and it just slipped my mind. But one of the things that we talked about was we wear MSA mask in Jacksonville. We talked about using APRs with our mask to go in and do overhaul. Well, the problem with using APRs is that you have to have the APR filter for the known agent that you're going to be exposed to. And that there, as far as I understand and what I've been told, I may be wrong on this, I am by no means the expert, but that there is no APR filter available that I'm aware of that will cover everything that we are exposed to. So that's why we are sticking with the self-contained breathing apparatus. Bobby, would you have any insight on that?
Trevor, that was a perfect answer. Based on what we know with today's technology and science, the state-of-the-art, the best alternative is to wear a fully contained breathing apparatus. The reason for that, as Trevor just said so eloquently, the multitude of product that we have is so widespread, and depending upon what you may have encountered, you may have put on a respiratory protection device that has some limited protection, but not for the wide variety of product that you're possible to encounter. So please wear a fully contained breathing apparatus. If it's MSA, wear your MSA. If it's an Aspiro Scott, whatever it is, wear your standard breathing apparatus. That's your absolute best protection.
And also wearing full PPE with it, because skin exposure is just as damaging as respiratory exposure.
Yeah, and we're gonna, that's a great. There's a great debate question and a great look at the study that's going on right now down here at the Illinois Fire Institute. And I know they're not going to that question, but the Gear Manufacturers Globe is very involved down here, and the Gear Manufacturers obviously looking at that. Will we be putting on Tyvek suits and perhaps other gear to do overhaul in the future? Quite possibly. There's been discussion in the American Fire Service about should overhaul, that were what Trevor referred to as defensive, should that be handled by outside agencies? In other words, the question was raised at a conference I was at recently at a hazmat scene. We don't do cleanup. We just go and mitigate the initial hazard, but then professionals come in or private corporations come in and do the hazardous materials cleanup. And the discussion came up, and it's a good discussion. Will overhaul, significant overhaul, be delegated out in the future? I don't know. I hope not. I think that we should become better at it and more proficient at it and keep it under our auspices as part of our public service, but that's my opinion, and it could change. What do you think, Trevor?
I agree.
Oh, that was easy.
Nobody wants to give up their fire. It's hard to get those initial crews to give up their fire. But obviously, if you know that you're worn out and you would rather, okay, if I give you the option of, hey, you either got to wear your full gear with your SCBA and go back in and do overhaul, or we've got another crew that's fresh that can do it. And we know that the number one injury on the Fireground is sprains and strains. And then when you're tired, there's more susceptibility to that. So I think that by having that fresh crew come on the scene, whoever that may be, is going to be helpful.
Well, Trevor, not to correct you again, but the leading injury in the fire service is still hurt feelings. So we have to be careful. So here's a really interesting question, Trevor, and I don't know if you've looked into it, but I did get some information just yesterday from one of the NIOSH people, and it comes to us again from my good buddy Rob Fling out there in New York, and he asks, Chief, have you studied the benefits of vigorous exercise in the detox of the body, for example, infrared or sauna?
I have not.
You looked at it, Trevor? Well, it was interesting. That question came up yesterday, Robert. Go ahead, Trevor.
No, go ahead. You're going to expound on that?
That question did come up yesterday, and the NIOSH researcher on particulates and aerosolized products said that that increased cardiovascular activity and respiratory rate, et cetera, actually increased the potential for particulates to be absorbed. And then Dr. Smith came back, and I'll refer you to that webcast, which will be up on June 30th. It's being edited down. We streamed it live yesterday, but we're going to do some editing to it, add some additional footage, and repost it on June 30th. But Dr. Smith answered that that was for non-firefighting studies where people had breathed in aerosolized particulate matters, and it was not really focused on the detoxification issue as Rob's asking about here. So the short answer, unfortunately, the jury's still out. It seems to be a good way to detox the body from other products. It would seem logical that it would work with other contaminants. But to be honest, Robert, the best answer I have right now is that's under study and review. But obviously physical conditioning for all the other issues we face, cardiovascular-wise, is clearly a key. And we know that increasing our cardiovascular capability greatly reduces our liability on the fireground and improves our ability to do our job. So the short answer is we're not sure about particulates, but we're absolutely positive that exercise is critical for cardiovascular and overall functioning on the fireground. You ready for your next question, boss?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Getting a second set of gear, and this is from Steve DeLuca. Getting a second set of gear is ideal, but how can we go about getting the funding for this?
Like I was saying, that in our department, 1,200 folks, it's a major ordeal to talk about in this department. And I imagine a lot of departments, especially with the 10-year replacement policy and everything, it's tough getting a new set for everybody, even an initial set. So the only thing I can think of is that we can get some buy-in from some of the AFG grants or something along that lines. Maybe getting grant or just putting the information out there that this is as important as having having extra uniforms and everything else. It's just something that's got to be brought to the top as being important. I think having the extractors in some of our stations, we've got I think 8 or 9 stations that have the washer extractors, and that's a help. And we're promoting the washer gear as when it gets extremely dirty and everything, and grossly deconted on the scene. But I know that this is an issue. I'm not sure where the funding is going to come from, but I think that it's very important.
Yeah, and I think that just from my standpoint, the funding needs to come locally. If we're going to outfit firefighters with gear, then 2 sets of gear should be the minimum. And it's not just the contaminants, it's also wet gear. You shouldn't be going out to a fire. Obviously, fighting fire, we never get wet. That never happens. Duh. So wet gear reduces the capability of the gear to protect you. So a second set of gear should not be something that's optional for firefighters. It should be something that's just standard. And that should be borne by the communities, if it's a career department, or by the volunteer organizations if they want to help support the firefighters in getting it. But that's clearly just at this day and age. But also, Steve, just so you're aware, there's studies being done down in Australia right now with gear manufacturers and folks down there about removable outer shells and whether or not that's going to support. But as Trevor said, we're seeing that these contaminants permeate, far beyond just the outer shell, so we're not sure if that's going to hold up. But the good news is that lots of folks, smart folks, are looking at it. But I would highly recommend for any organization that they always go with 2 sets of gear at a minimum. That's a good firefighting.
I think Don Pence has got a good answer on that also up there
Don?
in our Q&A.
Yeah, go ahead.
There you go. It says we are working on fundraisers as well as educating the public in firefighter cancer awareness by attending local fairs and bazaars. I think that's great. Is getting the information out there, having those council people that make those decisions coming right along with you, and especially when you get done with a fire and they say, well, and you can say, hey, look, this is what we have. We got 23 more hours on shift, and we're going to have to wear this stuff all the rest of the day. It's going to be in our cab with us the rest of the day, and it's covered in contaminants. And you're going to get to ride along with us. So I think that does help get those ideas about funding is having good public relations, whether it be with the public itself or with your elected officials.
And James Williams just chimed in. He says, has anyone seen the information from a chief in Canada who's installed saunas and low-level cardio to help detox? I've heard some anecdotal stuff about that, Trevor. I don't know if you've heard more. My buddy Pete McBride up there was talking about that the other day, but I have not heard anything definitive of it, nor have I heard whether the Canadian Fire Service had authorized that as through their medical review yet.
Right. I haven't heard anything.
Yeah. All right, let's go to a couple more here. And Trevor, it's good that here's a really interesting question from Steve DeLuca, and I think it's kind of what we've been kicking around here all day. How do I get firefighters to embrace this change? Any more suggestions, Trevor?
Sadly, it takes a catastrophic event to change our mindset. Just like I talked about in my PowerPoint with a beloved lieutenant got caught in a fire with a canister mask and he died. The autopsy showed it was anoxia. And the SCBAs were available, but they weren't being used. And I think that it also takes that chief making that line in the sand and saying, hey, that whoever the chief officer is, you got to get buy-in, obviously, but you also have got to hold the line and say, hey, this is the way we're going to start moving in our department, and have that. Sometimes we have to have that cultural change that way, but sadly, a lot of times it happens when we have a tragic situation, and I think that as we start opening the eyes of with documentation showing the firefighters that are passing away quickly after they leave the job, or the ones that are actually on the job that have cancer, that are fighting cancer, and start recognizing that there possibly is an exposure from being on this job, that maybe that will help change the culture.
Yeah, and I think it's behavior that we're trying to change, and we did it with bunker gear. When I came on, it was 3/4 boots and long jackets. Then we moved to bunker gear. SCBA use back in the 70s was sporadic. Now it's just what we do. So we're evolving through our knowledge and skills and abilities as a profession, and our cultural values and our traditions and the things that are good and great about us are not going to change. And people often confuse behavior with tradition, and they're two radically different things. Behavior is just some normative stuff, and we change that all. There's no organization or industry in the world that's been more adaptable, pliable, or creative and embracing of change than the American Fire Service. And as folks, and especially firefighters, learn more about this, but look at all the departments that are doing hood exchanges already. We're washing our hoods on Sundays, and many departments have decided to take it a step further, and they're actually doing hood exchanges at every fire. You get done with the fire, you turn in your hood, they give you a new hood, clean hood. So we're going to see this sweep through the system really quickly, because firefighters embrace change, positive and meaningful change, as part of our culture. We are a culture of positive change, and that is never going to change. Let's see what we got here. Here's one question. Was there any research completed on fire department facility stations contributing to cancer? He asked about recovery systems, personal decon, no gear in the living room. That comes to us from Scott Lance. Anything?
We haven't done any here in Jacksonville on this, but I'm not sure if there's any done throughout the country. I have heard some about this, and Bobby, you may have a better idea on that.
Steve, you're spot on. There have been dozens of studies about the existence of carcinogens in fire stations, and it was found that it was 100% because of the diesel contamination, and that's why those extractor systems are so important, and an annual, at least deep cleaning, if not painting, is important. That's why the station design has developed many of these airlock systems that separate the apparatus bays from the living areas. So there has been a ton of work, and we do know that the stations do get contaminated, and now we're learning that we're also contaminating even further with the presence of our gear. And I know that Trevor's been very eloquent about not bringing it into the bunk room, but I think I would go a step further and say don't even bring it into the station. In other words, keep it in the apparatus bay or specially designed lockers. I'm sure we're going to see advanced bags produced in the near future that are going to be lined with something to help contain the contaminants. And then as best we can in the organizations that are able to, that the decon and many departments are already doing this. Down in Florida, Steve, I know of a department that actually picks up the gear after every fire. They decon it, and then they get it back to their firefighters. There's one I know in Florida and one I know in Canada. So we're really ramping up our awareness of this, and we're really pushing it out there. And yes, we have had some studies, and we will have more. A lot of it's dependent on funding, but it's also the awareness level, and it's growing every day. And thanks to good folks like Trevor and our folks at Tempest, we're able to get that kind of information out there.
Yes, sir.
Trevor, you want to grab any less of these that, again, Scott just asked us about policies that are current about hood exchanges. I don't have one, Scott, but I can refer you to Cobb County, Georgia, where I know they're doing that. And the person to get a hold of there would be Sean Gray, if that helps Scott on that one. Do you have one for him, Trevor? Department policy on hood exchange?
I don't. Okay. And what we're trying to suggest is that if we can get a second hood, and a lot of times on hood exchange, the only issue I see with that is somebody might not want to wear somebody else's old hood. So if everybody has two hoods, if you have two, then you can wash your own. That's kind of my thinking on that.
I think the hood exchange they give them clean, laundered hoods. I'm sure they do. It's not but I'm sure they're just not recycling dirty hoods. That would be nonsensical. But you never know.
No. I was just said.
They should.
Yeah,
go ahead, Trevor.
That's okay. I was just thinking that they would want to get their own hood back. That was my idea.
Huh? Really?
Their clean hood. Yes.
I know.
Yeah.
Huh. I never thought anybody would be that parochial about a hood, but possibly. Possibly. Huh. Okay. Well, that would be interesting to me. How they would do that, or perhaps, as Trevor said, issue multiple hoods, which I would just consider part of your standard PPE, from my opinion, and from an organizational opinion. Well, listen, we're up against a hard break. Trevor, that was a great presentation. Obviously, tons of interest in the topic. Please note that if you registered, you will be sent an email that this is being archived for you within 24 hours. If you want to get a hold of Trevor, how do folks get a hold of you?
I guess I'm on Twitter. I've never. You can look me up, Trevor Nelson, on there, and I'm on Facebook too. So I guess those are two ways now that we communicate with folks.
Good. Okay, so you can get a hold of Trevor on Facebook or Twitter at any time. We'd like to thank our friends at Tempest. What an amazing company. Please go to Tempest.com. You saw how Trevor's organization are using fans to try to improve the Fireground environment prior to what Trevor described as the defensive operations or overhaul. Great suggestion. Tempest has an incredible array of fans and a huge partner with all the research we're doing. So please go to Tempest.com and support our friends who support firefighters and who support educating firefighters and who support, being there for firefighters. So great organization, state-of-the-art equipment, wonderful people. I know them personally. I know the family who own the corporation, and they're just deeply involved in day-to-day operations. They take it very seriously. Much like Trevor, they're a second-generation firefighting company, Tempest is, And you couldn't ask for better people, and you couldn't spend your money more wisely than supporting a company like Tempest. And we want to thank them so much for their support of this today. Trevor, we want to thank you. Thank you to everybody for tuning in with us today. And I'm Bobby Halton. I'm down here in Champaign, Illinois with the University of Illinois and the Illinois Fire Services Institute, our good friends from Skidmore College, the good folks from NIST, NIOSH, UL, and we're continuing to study this issue, and as news breaks on this, we'll get it out to you. There will be that studies report that we did yesterday will be up on June 30th, so look for that. And thank you so much for joining, Trevor. We look forward to your next article and
yes, sir.
And seeing you at FDIC. And thank you so much for participating with us today. And everyone out there, have a fantastic day. And remember, be careful out there.